Have you ever considered the ghastly spectacle of a king devoured alive by worms? A tale so shocking, so seemingly biblical in its grotesque justice, that it transcends mere historical record and enters the realm of cautionary legend. This isn't a fable spun from the ether. It's the documented demise of Herod Agrippa I, a figure of immense power in the first century. A story etched in both the sacred texts of the Bible and the secular chronicles of historians like Josephus. His life, a whirlwind of political maneuvering and Roman favor, ultimately crashed down in a horrifying display of divine retribution, a stark testament to the age-old adage, "Pride goeth before a fall." But was it truly divine intervention, or a confluence of biological misfortune exacerbated by unchecked ego? Let's delve into the multifaceted narrative of Herod Agrippa I, a man whose rise and fall serve as a chilling reminder of the corrupting nature of power and the enduring relevance of humility. Agrippa's life began with a silver spoon, or perhaps a gilded scepter, firmly in his grasp. Born in 3 BC, he was the grandson of Herod the Great, the very monarch who, consumed by paranoia and political insecurity, ordered the infamous massacre of the innocents in a desperate attempt to eliminate the prophesied Messiah, the baby Jesus. Talk about family baggage. This lineage placed Agrippa within the upper echelons of Judean society, a family intertwined with the Roman Empire, enjoying its benefits but also subject to its whims. They were, in essence, Roman royalty, ruling with the authority granted by and beholden to the distant emperor. Growing up in Rome afforded Agrippa a privileged upbringing. He received an education befitting a future leader, immersing himself in the classics, mastering the art of diplomacy, and navigating the treacherous currents of Roman politics. He wasn't just rubbing shoulders with senators and dignitaries, he was forging lifelong bonds, most notably with the future Emperor Claudius. Imagine the dinner parties, the casual conversations that shaped the course of history. From a young age, Agrippa was immersed in a world of power, influence, and ambition, a world that would mold him into a shrewd, albeit ultimately flawed, ruler. What distinguished Agrippa from other puppet rulers of the era was his uncanny ability to straddle the divide between Roman and Jewish sensibilities. He possessed a rare political acumen, a knack for appeasing both his Roman overlords and his Jewish subjects, a feat akin to juggling flaming torches while walking a tightrope. To the Romans, he presented himself as a loyal and capable administrator, a reliable ally in a volatile region. He understood their language, their customs, their thirst for stability and order. To the Jews, however, he cultivated the image of a devout and respectful leader, a king who honored their traditions, upheld their laws, and genuinely cared for their well-being. Upon assuming his royal duties in Jerusalem, Agrippa shrewdly capitalized on this carefully crafted persona. He immersed himself in Jewish customs, participating in temple celebrations with visible enthusiasm, offering sacrifices with meticulous adherence to religious law, and generally demonstrating a respect for Jewish traditions that had been conspicuously absent in many of his predecessors. He wasn't just going through the motions, he was actively engaging with the religious leaders, consulting with rabbis, and seeking their counsel on matters of state. This genuine engagement, or at least the convincing appearance thereof, resonated deeply with the Jewish population, who had long yearned for a leader who understood and respected their unique cultural and religious identity. The rabbis revered him, the people respected him, and his influence within Judea swelled, solidifying his position as a powerful and popular ruler. He rebuilt parts of Jerusalem that had fallen into disrepair, further endearing himself to the populace. For the first time in a long time, The Jews felt they had a king who truly cared about their needs and aspirations. But lurking beneath this carefully constructed facade was a dangerous undercurrent: pride. As Agrippa's power grew, so did his ego, inflating to a point where he began to believe his own press clippings, so to speak. The adulation and respect he received fueled a sense of self-importance, blurring the lines between mortal ruler and divine figure. He started to perceive himself as more than just a king, edging closer to believing he was an almost godlike figure, deserving of reverence beyond the realm of earthly leadership. This hubris, this overweening pride, would prove to be his undoing, fulfilling the biblical prophecy: pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16:18. The seeds of his downfall were sown in the fertile ground of his own inflated ego. The power he wielded, the ability to dictate life and death, began to corrupt his judgment, warping his perspective on justice and morality. He became increasingly ruthless, willing to sacrifice principles and even human lives to maintain his grip on power and further enhance his popularity. This ambition manifested itself in a disturbing persecution of the early followers of Jesus, not out of religious conviction, but as a calculated political move. He recognized that targeting the nascent Christian community would curry favor with powerful factions within the Jewish leadership, solidifying his political standing and silencing potential dissent. Agrippa's persecution of Christians wasn't driven by theological differences. It was pure political expediency. He saw an opportunity to consolidate his power by appealing to the conservative elements within Jewish society who viewed the growing Christian movement as a threat to traditional religious practices and social order. This cold calculation revealed a disturbing lack of moral compass, a willingness to exploit religious tensions for personal gain. Within a remarkably short period, Agrippa consolidated his rule, becoming the undisputed sovereign of Judea. He controlled nearly as much territory as his infamous grandfather, Herod the Great, a testament to his political acumen and ruthlessness. He embarked on ambitious building projects, fortifying Jerusalem's defenses, staging lavish games and festivals. To entertain the populace and project an image of prosperity and stability, and solidifying his position as one of the most influential figures in the Eastern Mediterranean. He was at the apex of his power, seemingly untouchable, basking in the glow of Roman favor and popular acclaim. It's a truism of history that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Agrippa's story is a stark illustration of this principle. The very qualities that had enabled his rise, his political savvy, his diplomatic skills, his ability to manipulate public opinion, were ultimately twisted by his unchecked ambition and inflated ego, leading him down a path of moral compromise and ultimately to his gruesome demise. He became a man who would stop at nothing to maintain his political power, even if it meant sacrificing innocent lives and betraying his own principles. This descent into moral darkness marked a particularly bleak period for the early church in Jerusalem. Agrippa, sensing an opportunity to further ingratiate himself with Jewish leaders, launched a targeted campaign against the followers of Jesus, unleashing a wave of persecution that tested the faith and resilience of the fledgling Christian community. The Bible recounts this dark chapter in Acts 12:12:1, stating, "At that time, King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them." The motivation wasn't religious zeal, it was pure, unadulterated political calculation. The first casualty of Agrippa's persecution was James, the brother of John, one of Jesus' closest disciples, a member of the inner circle who had witnessed the Transfiguration and shared in some of the most intimate moments of Jesus' ministry. This was no ordinary follower. This was a pillar of the early church. Agrippa, without hesitation, ordered James to be executed by the sword, making him the first apostle to be martyred for his faith. This act of brutality sent shockwaves through the Christian community, signaling a new era of persecution and testing the limits of their commitment. The execution of James was met with approval by Agrippa's political allies, emboldening him to escalate his campaign against the Christians. Seeing that the death of James pleased the Jewish leaders, Agrippa turned his attention to Peter, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, a figure of immense authority and influence within the Christian community. Peter was arrested during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, a significant religious holiday that attracted large crowds to Jerusalem. Agrippa strategically timed the arrest to coincide with this period, maximizing the impact and sending a clear message to the Christian community that their faith would not be tolerated. 16 soldiers were assigned to guard Peter, divided into 4 squads of 4, each taking shifts to ensure his escape was impossible. The security was tight, the odds stacked against Peter's survival. While Peter languished in prison, the Agrippa church gathered in fervent prayer, beseeching God for his deliverance. They understood the gravity of the situation, the potential for further persecution, and the devastating impact Peter's loss would have on the fledgling Christian community. Their prayers were a lifeline, a testament to their unwavering faith and their desperate hope for divine intervention. And then something extraordinary happened, something that defied all logic and reason. An angel of the Lord appeared in Peter's prison cell, bathed in a radiant light that shattered the darkness and silenced the despair. The chains that bound Peter's wrists miraculously fell away, symbols of earthly captivity dissolving in the presence of divine power. The angel guided Peter out of the prison, past the sleeping guards, through the locked gates, and into the silent streets of Jerusalem, a miraculous escape that left the Christian community in awe and wonder. When Agrippa discovered Peter's escape, he was enraged, his authority challenged, his carefully orchestrated plan thwarted. He ordered a thorough investigation, interrogating the guards, and ultimately sentencing them to death for their perceived negligence. This act of retribution, however, couldn't mask the fact that Agrippa had been outmaneuvered, his power limited, his plans foiled by a force beyond his comprehension. The contrasting fates of James and Peter raise profound theological questions about divine sovereignty and human suffering. Why was James allowed to be martyred, while Peter was miraculously rescued? These are the mysteries of God's plans, the inscrutable ways in which divine purpose unfolds, often beyond our understanding. Yet, within these apparent contradictions, there lies a deeper truth. God's ultimate plan is not always aligned with our immediate desires or expectations, but it always serves a greater purpose. Despite the setbacks, Agrippa pressed on with his persecution, intensifying the pressure on Jesus' followers throughout Jerusalem. Families were torn apart, livelihoods destroyed, and many were forced to flee the city, seeking refuge in other regions. However, as often happens in the history of Christianity, persecution had the unintended consequence of spreading the gospel. The Christians who were scattered by Agrippa's actions carried their faith with them, planting seeds of belief in new communities and expanding the reach of the Christian message. It was as if Agrippa's very attempts to suppress the gospel were inadvertently contributing to its proliferation, fulfilling Jesus' command to spread the good news to all the world. As Agrippa tightened his grip on power, a subtle yet significant shift occurred in his demeanor. The man once admired for his political finesse and diplomatic skills began to morph into a figure consumed by arrogance and self-worship, demanding to be treated as something more than human. He was losing touch with reality, blinded by his own ambition and deafened by the sycophantic praise of his courtiers. He failed to heed the warning signs, the subtle indicators of impending disaster, oblivious to the fact that his pride was paving the way for his ultimate downfall. Agrippa's story serves as a powerful reminder that harming God's people is never a prudent course of action. As the words of Gamaliel in Acts 5:39 caution, "If it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God." Agrippa, in his arrogance, had placed himself in opposition to a force far greater than himself, a force that would ultimately bring him to his knees. The events that transpired in Caesarea would forever alter the trajectory of Herod Agrippa's life, marking the beginning of his agonizing end. It was a seemingly ordinary day when Agrippa decided to make a grand public appearance, an event meticulously planned to showcase his power and prestige. Tensions were high in the region, particularly between Agrippa and the cities of Tyre and Sidon. These prosperous coastal cities were heavily dependent on Agrippa's territories for their food supply, relying on the import of grain and other essential commodities to sustain their populations. A dispute had arisen between Agrippa and these cities, leading him to sever trade relations, effectively cutting off their lifeline. The Bible doesn't explicitly detail the cause of the rift, but given Agrippa's inflated ego, it likely stemmed from a perceived slight to his authority or a calculated power play. The situation was dire for Tyre and Sidon, their citizens facing the specter of famine and economic collapse. Desperate to resolve the crisis, representatives from these cities sought an audience with Agrippa, hoping to negotiate a restoration of trade relations. Recognizing the futility of a direct appeal to Agrippa's pride, they cleverly befriended Blastus, the king's cupbearer, a close personal assistant who enjoyed Agrippa's trust and confidence. They knew that Blastus held the key to gaining access to the king and pleading their case. Agrippa, sensing an opportunity to assert his dominance and bask in the adulation of his subjects, decided to orchestrate a grand spectacle, a public display of his power and magnanimity. He chose the second day of a major festival as the occasion for his appearance, ensuring a large and enthusiastic audience. He spared no expense in preparing for the event, meticulously planning every detail to maximize its impact. On that fateful day, Agrippa emerged from the palace, resplendent in his royal attire. Historians, including Josephus, describe his garment as being entirely crafted from silver, shimmering brilliantly in the morning sun. The effect was dazzling, almost otherworldly, enhancing his regal presence and captivating the attention of the assembled crowd. As Agrippa ascended the stage to deliver his speech, a pivotal moment arrived, a crossroads that would determine his ultimate fate. The sun's rays reflected off his silver garment, creating a blinding radiance that amplified his presence and evoked a sense of awe among the onlookers. The crowd, swept away by the spectacle, erupted in spontaneous applause and adulation, their voices rising in a crescendo of praise. But then, something unexpected happened. Emboldened by the spectacle and the king's seemingly divine radiance, the people began shouting, "This is the voice of a god, not a man." In that critical moment, Agrippa faced a crucial choice. He could have rejected the idolatrous worship, acknowledging the sovereignty of God and redirecting the praise to its rightful recipient. As a Jewish king, he was bound by the first commandment, which explicitly prohibits the worship of any other gods. But instead, Agrippa succumbed to the temptation of vanity, accepting the praise as his due, reveling in the delusion of his own divinity. He stood there, basking in the adoration, implicitly endorsing the blasphemous pronouncements of the crowd. At that precise moment, the tide turned irrevocably. The Bible recounts that an angel of the Lord immediately struck Agrippa down because he did not give glory to God. The consequences were swift and devastating, plunging him from the pinnacle of power and prestige to the depths of agonizing suffering. The details of his demise are so gruesome and unsettling that they are recorded not only in the biblical narrative, but also in the historical accounts of Josephus, providing corroborating evidence of the tragic events that unfolded in Caesarea. Josephus provides a harrowing description of Agrippa's suffering, detailing the onset of excruciating stomach pain that forced him to be carried out of the theater. His moment of triumph transformed into a spectacle of agony. The very people who had moments before hailed him as a god now witnessed his humiliating descent into mortal suffering. What is particularly striking is that Agrippa's death wasn't instantaneous. It was a prolonged and agonizing ordeal. For 5 agonizing days, he endured excruciating pain as worms began to consume his body from within. A grotesque and humiliating fate for a man who had aspired to divinity. The man who had allowed himself to be worshipped as a god was now experiencing one of the most degrading and painful deaths imaginable. This event in Caesarea serves as a potent reminder of the dangers of pride and the consequences of defying divine authority. The same man who had persecuted Christians, who had elevated himself above human limitations, now faced the ultimate judgment, a stark demonstration of the futility of earthly power and the enduring truth of the proverb. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Herod Agrippa's death was more than just a historical event. It was a watershed moment that exposed the corrupting influence of pride and the enduring power of divine justice. Let us examine the heart-wrenching details of his final hours, a scene that resonates with tragedy and serves as a cautionary tale for generations to come. Imagine the scene. The once dazzling king, adorned in his shimmering silver garments, now writhing in agony, his body ravaged by an unseen torment. The royal physicians, renowned for their expertise, were baffled, unable to comprehend the nature of his affliction. They had never encountered anything like it, a disease that seemed to be consuming the king from the inside out. Ancient historians describe Agrippa's condition as a vermicular disease, a horrifying infestation of worms that began to devour his internal organs while he was still alive. The stench emanating from his body was so repulsive that few could bear to be in his presence. Even his most loyal servants were forced to take turns tending to his needs, unable to endure the unbearable odor for extended periods. It's noteworthy that Agrippa's gruesome demise wasn't an isolated incident in biblical history. Other figures who had dared to usurp divine authority had met similar fates. Consider the case of King Nebuchadnezzar, who, in his arrogance, elevated himself to divine status and was subsequently humbled, forced to live like an animal for 7 years. The key difference lies in Nebuchadnezzar's eventual repentance, which led to his restoration. The physicians of the time desperately tried to alleviate Agrippa's suffering, employing a variety of remedies, including ointments, medicinal herbs, and ritualistic healing practices. But their efforts were futile, powerless against the force that was consuming him. It was as if a higher power had decreed his fate, demonstrating that no human intervention could thwart divine judgment. As Agrippa's condition deteriorated, news of his suffering spread throughout the city. The same people who had recently proclaimed him a god now whispered in hushed tones about the gruesome details of his demise. The irony of his situation lost on no one. As Psalm 75:7 states, "It is God who judges. He brings one down, he exalts another." The Christians who had endured Agrippa's persecution saw his demise as an act of divine justice, not as an opportunity for revenge. The early church learned a profound lesson. God does not require human intervention to defend his honor. He is fully capable of executing justice in his own time and in his own way. Agrippa's suffering was so intense that his screams echoed through the palace halls, a constant reminder of his agonizing torment. His own children were unable to bear his presence, repulsed by the stench and horrified by his physical deterioration. The man who had cultivated an image of power and divinity was reduced to a state of utter helplessness and degradation, a fate that no one, not even his worst enemy, would have wished upon him. According to historical accounts, Agrippa, in his final moments, came to a profound realization of the magnitude of his transgression. Perhaps he recalled the words of the prophet Isaiah, "All people are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field." Isaiah 46. All his power, all his influence, all his victories, none of it mattered in the face of death. The fifth day of Agrippa's suffering proved to be the most agonizing. The worms had multiplied exponentially, devouring his body from within, inflicting unimaginable pain. Finally, his heart gave way, bringing an end to his torment. The great King Herod Agrippa I, who had allowed himself to be worshipped as a god, died in the most humiliating and agonizing way imaginable. This death was a pivotal moment in the history of the early church, marking the end of one of its most formidable persecutors. As Galatians 6:7 states, "Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." The condition that afflicted Herod Agrippa, known in ancient medicine as worm disease, has been the subject of much speculation among modern historians and medical professionals. Some believe it may have been a severe form of intestinal parasites, possibly exacerbated by other underlying health issues. The symptoms described by Josephus, intense abdominal pain, a foul odor, and the visible presence of worms, are consistent with this diagnosis. What is particularly intriguing is that similar conditions are mentioned in other historical records, often associated with tyrannical rulers or those who claimed divine status. In the Bible, the account in Acts 12:23 states, "Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died." Herod Agrippa's death imparts a powerful lesson about the perils of pride. Proverbs 16:18 warns us that pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. This proverb finds its clearest and most dramatic illustration in the New Testament in the fate of Herod Agrippa Thirster. His story underscores the biblical principle that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. While Agrippa persecuted the church and accepted divine worship, God was preparing a judgment that would serve as a timeless warning against the dangers of self-exaltation. Agrippa's story finds resonance in other biblical narratives, such as the account of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4, who was humbled after boasting of his own greatness, and the story of Pharaoh in the book of Exodus, who stubbornly resisted God's will and ultimately faced destruction. King Uzziah, in 2 Chronicles 26, was also punished with leprosy for his prideful attempt to usurp priestly duties. The lessons of Agrippa's life and death remain relevant today, even in a world where few openly declare themselves gods. Pride manifests itself in more subtle ways, often lurking beneath the surface of our social media profiles, our workplace ambitions, and our interpersonal relationships. The temptation to elevate ourselves, to seek validation and admiration from others, is ever present. Jesus offered a contrasting path in Matthew 23:12. "For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." This is a lesson that requires daily practice, a conscious effort to acknowledge that all our talents and successes ultimately originate from God. Humility isn't weakness, it is a source of profound wisdom. As Christians, we are called to emulate the example of Jesus, who, despite being God, humbled himself by taking on the form of a servant. Philippians 2:7. The tragic end of Herod Agrippa left an enduring legacy, a cautionary tale that continues to resonate across the centuries. His story is more than just a historical account. It is a living reminder of the consequences of unchecked pride and the enduring truth that all glory belongs to God alone. 1 Peter 5:5 reminds us, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Today, as we visit the ruins of Caesarea, the site of Agrippa's dramatic downfall, we can reflect on the fleeting nature of earthly power and the enduring relevance of humility. The theater where he delivered his fateful speech still stands, a silent monument to the perils of pride and the triumph of divine justice. In the end, the worms inherited the kingdom of Herod Agrippa. The most amazing biblical stories serve as warnings and reminders to keep our egos in check and give all the glory to God. Let us know your thoughts in the comments.